What if the most important thing about your life is not happening outside of you at all? What if everything you have been taught to call reality is only the shadow and the true cause of it exists somewhere you rarely look, somewhere you rarely trust, somewhere you rarely take seriously? Because if you follow this carefully, not as belief but as observation, you begin to notice something unsettling the world. You see feels solid, feels external, feels independent. But your experience of it is always internal, always filtered, always shaped before you even realize it. And that means something very simple but very radical. What you call life is not something you are facing. It is something you are expressing. You have been trained to trust what is visible, to give authority to what appears, to believe that what you can touch, measure, and confirm is what is real. But there is another way of seeing this entirely, one that feels almost inverted at first, almost unnatural. What if the visible world is not the cause, but the result? What if the invisible, the imagined, the felt is the only true reality, and everything else is just its projection? Because if imagination is the source, then everything you experience must first exist within you before it appears outside of you. Not symbolically, not metaphorically, but literally. And if that is true, then the entire structure of how you understand cause and effect begins to reverse. So now the question is no longer what is happening to me, but what is happening within me that appears as this. Because if the inner world is the cause, then every reaction, every assumption, every quiet belief you carry is not just personal, it is creative. It is selecting what you see. It is shaping how reality organizes itself around you. And this is why the statement feels so difficult at first, almost uncomfortable to accept. Nothing you experience is separate from you. It is you pushed out into form. Not because you consciously chose it, but because you have been continuously assuming something, continuously identifying as someone, continuously feeling from a certain state. And that state is what is being reflected back to you. So again, slowly, honestly, what are you assuming yourself to be right now? Not what you say, not what you want, but what you feel yourself to be, without effort, without trying. Because that feeling, that quiet identity beneath your thoughts, is the foundation of everything you experience. And if you do not question it, it remains. If you do not change it, it repeats. Not randomly, not unfairly, but precisely. Because reality does not argue with you, it reflects you. And the moment you begin to see that, even slightly, something shifts not outside, but inside your understanding. You realize that you have not been trying to change your life. You have been trying to change reflections while leaving the source untouched. So the shift begins here, not in effort, not in force, but in recognition. Recognition that the kingdom you have been searching for is not somewhere else, not something to be reached, but something already within you, already active, already creating. And if it is within you, then the only place anything can truly change is within you. Not later, not eventually, but now. And if you allow this idea to go just a little deeper, not as something you agree with, but as something you test, another realization begins to unfold, one that changes everything about how you relate to your life. Because if the visible world is only a shadow, then it has no independent power of its own. It cannot initiate, it cannot decide, it cannot create, it can only reflect. And if it only reflects, then whatever you are seeing now is not something that is happening to you. It is something that has already happened within you. This is where the mind resists, because it has been conditioned to look outward for causes, to blame circumstances, to explain results based on what is seen. But what if what is seen is always late? What if it is always the echo, never the voice? Because an echo does not begin anything. It only returns what has already been spoken. And reality works the same way. It does not argue. It does not question. It simply echoes what you are being. So if you are being uncertain, you will encounter uncertainty. If you are being fulfilled, you will begin to experience fulfillment. Not because something outside chooses, but because nothing outside has the authority to choose. So now the process becomes very precise, almost unavoidable in its logic. You are not imagining to create something new. You are always imagining, always assuming, always feeling from a state. And that state is continuously projecting itself into your world. The only difference is whether you are aware of it or not. Because unconscious imagination feels like fate, but conscious imagination feels like creation. And the shift between the two is not in technique, it is in awareness. So again, quietly, are you reacting to what you see, or are you aware of what you are being? Because reaction ties you to the shadow. It keeps you focused on the effect. It reinforces what has already been created. But awareness returns you to the source, to the place where everything actually begins. And once you return to that place, something becomes clear. You do not need to fight reality. You do not need to fix it. You do not need to control it, because it is not independent. It is obedient. But obedience does not respond to your words. It responds to your state. And state is not what you declare. It is what you feel yourself to be. So you can say anything you want. You can repeat ideas, affirmations, concepts. But if the feeling beneath them does not change, nothing changes, because feeling is the anchor, the point where imagination becomes real to you. And what is real to you internally must eventually appear externally, not because of effort, but because of correspondence. So the shift is not in doing more, it is in being differently. Not in forcing belief, but in entering a state and remaining there long enough for it to feel natural. Because what feels natural becomes dominant, and what becomes dominant becomes reality. So if you can feel something as real within you, even before you see it, even before you can explain it, even before it makes sense, you are already moving it into form. And this is why faith is not about hoping something will happen. It is about accepting that what is unseen is more real than what is seen. Because what is seen came from what was unseen. So if you trust the unseen, you are trusting the source. But if you depend on the seen, you're depending on the shadow. And shadows do not create anything, they only follow. So now the question becomes unavoidable. Are you living from what you see or from what you know within? Because one keeps you reacting, repeating, reinforcing, while the other moves you into creation. And once you begin to live from within, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first, something begins to shift. Not dramatically, but undeniably. You start to feel less controlled by circumstances, less dependent on outcomes, less reactive to appearances, because you begin to recognize that what you are seeing is not the beginning, it is the continuation. And if it is the continuation, then the only place anything new can begin is within you. And if the beginning is always within you, then the next question becomes unavoidable. Not how to change reality, but how to change the one who is experiencing it. Because everything you see is tied, not to effort, not to action, but to identity. Not the identity you describe to others. Not the one you perform, but the one you feel yourself to be when no one is watching, when nothing is required, when you are simply aware of yourself. That quiet sense of I am, that is the center of everything. And whatever you attach to that, whatever you accept as true about yourself, becomes the state you live in. So if you feel I am not enough, that becomes a state. If you feel I am chosen, that becomes a state. If you feel I am still waiting, that becomes a state. And each state is not passive, it is active. It is organizing your perception, shaping your reactions, selecting what you notice, and even influencing what appears. Because the state you occupy is the lens through which reality is filtered. So again, quietly, what are you identifying as right now? Not what you want to be, but what feels natural to you. Because what feels natural is what you return to, And what you return to is what defines your experience. And this is where the shift becomes very subtle, but very powerful. You are not trying to get something. You are not trying to reach something. You are not trying to fix something. You are selecting who you are. Because wanting is not the same as being. Wanting implies distance, implies lack, implies that something is not yet yours. But being removes distance entirely. Being says it is already done, already real, already part of you. And reality responds only to being, never to wanting. So as long as you remain in wanting, you remain in separation, and separation keeps repeating itself in your world. So the movement is not forward, it is inward. Not toward something, but into something, into a state that already exists within you, a version of yourself that is not created, but selected. Because every possible identity already exists as a state of consciousness, and you move between them not by effort, but by assumption. An assumption is not something you declare, it is something you feel as true. So if you can feel yourself as the one who already has it, even briefly, even imperfectly, you've already entered that state. And once you enter it, the only thing that matters is whether you remain there or leave. Because leaving returns you to the old identity, the old state, the old results. But remaining stabilizes the new one, allows it to feel natural, allows it to become you. And this is why persistence is not about repeating actions, it is about refusing to return to the old self. Not forcefully, not aggressively, but quietly, consistently, by noticing when you drift and gently returning to the state you have chosen. Because every time you return, you reinforce it. Every time you remain, you deepen it. And eventually, it stops feeling like something you are practicing and becomes something you are. So the question shifts again. Are you trying to change your life, or are you willing to become the one whose life is already different? Because only one of those creates real change. The other keeps you waiting. And if identity is the root, then everything else, circumstances, people, timing, is only the reflection of that root. So when you change identity, you do not chase results, results follow. Not instantly, not always visibly at first, but inevitably. Because once the state is stable, reality has no choice but to align with it. And this is where something inside you begins to understand, not logically, but directly. You are not small. You are not limited to what you see. You are the one who determines what is seen by determining who you are. And this is where most people unknowingly undo everything, not because they chose the wrong state, but because they refuse to remain in it. Because the moment the outer world does not immediately confirm what they have assumed, they begin to question it. They begin to check. They begin to look for evidence. And in doing so, they leave the very state they were trying to embody. So the issue is not imagination. It is not ability. It is not even belief. It is stability. Because you can enter a state for a moment. You can feel it, you can see it, you can even believe it. But if you do not remain, you return to the old identity, and the old identity continues to produce the same reality. Not because something went wrong, but because nothing actually changed at the level that matters. So again, quietly, are you entering the state, or are you living in it? Because there is a difference. Entering is temporary. It is something you visit, something you experience briefly before returning to what feels more familiar. But living in it means you no longer treat it as imagination. You treat it as reality, regardless of what appears. And this is where the real shift happens. Not when you feel it once, but when you refuse to leave it. Because leaving is almost always subtle. It does not feel like a decision. It feels like a reaction. You see something that contradicts your assumption, and instantly, without noticing, you identify with it. You feel doubt. You feel uncertainty. You feel the old version of yourself returning. And in that moment, you have shifted states. Not because the world forced you, but because you accepted what you saw as more real than what you had already assumed. So the discipline is not in forcing thoughts, not in controlling emotions, but in recognizing when you have left and returning. again and again, as many times as necessary, not with frustration, not with effort, but with awareness. Because awareness is what allows you to see the shift, and once you see it, you can choose differently. And this is why reaction is the only thing that delays manifestation. Not time, not circumstances, not complexity. Reaction. Because reaction pulls you back into the old state, and the old state recreates the old reality. But if you can remain, even when appearances contradict you, even when nothing seems to change, even when everything suggests otherwise, then you are no longer dependent on the world. You are established in the source. So the question becomes sharper now. Are you letting the world tell you who you are, or are you deciding who you are regardless of the world? Because only one of those leads to change. The other leads to repetition. And when you begin to remain more often than you react, something stabilizes. The state no longer feels fragile. It no longer feels like something that can be lost, because it is no longer something you are trying to maintain. It is something you are being. And being does not require effort. It only requires consistency. So you do not need to push reality. You do not need to chase results. You do not need to force anything into existence. You simply remain as the one who already is and allow reality to reflect it. Because reflection is inevitable. It is not something you earn. It is something that happens when the source is clear. And once you understand that, even slightly, everything becomes simpler. Not easier, but simpler. Because now there is only one thing to focus on. Remaining in the state you have chosen, regardless of what appears, until it feels natural, until it feels like you, until there is no difference between what you imagine and what you are. And once you begin to remain, even imperfectly, even inconsistently at first, something subtle starts to change in how you relate to what you desire. It no longer feels distant in the same way. It no longer feels like something you're trying to reach, something you're waiting for, something that must arrive from outside. Instead, it begins to feel closer, not physically, but internally, as if it already exists somewhere within you, waiting not to be created, but to be accepted. Because this is the part that is often misunderstood. You're not imagining to get something, you're imagining to experience it now. And that difference changes everything. When you imagine as a means to an end, you remain in wanting, you remain in distance, you remain in the state of not having. But when you imagine as an experience, as something that is already real within you, you move into being. And being is what creates. So again, quietly, if it were already yours, how would you feel? Not what would you think, not what would you say, but what would feel natural to you. Because that feeling is not something you wait for after the manifestation, it is the cause of it. And if you can access that feeling now, even briefly, even softly, you have already entered the state where it exists. And this is why feeling is not emotion in the way most people understand it. It is not intensity, not excitement, not forced positivity. It is a quiet sense of knowing, a naturalness, a kind of inner agreement that what you desire is already true. It feels ordinary, almost too simple to trust, because it lacks the drama that the mind expects. But that simplicity is precisely what makes it powerful. Because what feels natural becomes dominant, and what becomes dominant becomes reality. Not instantly in appearance, but immediately in identity. And identity is what reality follows. So when you feel it as natural, when you accept it as already part of you, you are no longer trying to make it happen, you are allowing it to express. So the practice becomes even more refined, even more inward. You do not try to visualize perfectly. You do not try to control every detail. You do not try to force clarity. You simply enter a scene, a moment, a feeling that implies your desire is already fulfilled, and you rest there. Not pushing it, not analyzing it, not checking it, but experiencing it as if it were happening now. And then you let it go, not because it failed, not because it was incomplete, but because it is done. Because once you have felt it as real, Once you have experienced it internally, there is nothing left to do. The seed has been planted. And just like any seed, it does not need to be dug up, checked, or forced to grow. It needs to be left alone. So the question shifts once more. Are you imagining to get, or are you imagining to be? Because one keeps you in effort, in repetition, in doubt. The other moves you into completion. And when you begin to imagine as being, not as getting, something inside you relaxes. The urgency disappears. The need to control fades. The constant checking dissolves. Because you no longer feel like something is missing. You feel like it is already yours. And when it feels like it is already yours, reality has no choice but to reflect that. And when you begin to experience this not as theory, but as something real within you, the entire structure of how you relate to the world starts to dissolve quietly, almost imperceptibly at first, because you begin to notice that nothing you see is truly independent. Nothing stands on its own. Nothing exists without being connected to the state you are occupying. And this is where something deeper becomes undeniable. The world is not happening to you, it is happening through you. Because once you understand that imagination is the source and feeling is the mechanism, then projection becomes inevitable. You are always projecting something, always expressing a state, always externalizing what is internal, even when you are unaware of it. So the question is no longer whether you are creating it, is what you are creating from lack or from fulfillment, from uncertainty or from knowing, from reaction or from awareness. So again, quietly, are you trying to change reality, or are you willing to change the state from which reality comes? Because these are not the same. Trying to change reality keeps you focused on appearances, keeps you reacting, adjusting, resisting, hoping that something will shift outside so that you can finally feel different inside. But changing your state reverses that entirely. You feel differently first. You assume differently first. You become different first, and reality follows. And once you begin to live from that understanding, something very specific happens. You stop taking appearances personally. You stop seeing them as fixed, as final, as meaningful in themselves. Instead, you begin to see them as indicators, reflections, feedback, not something to fight, but something to read. Because what you are seeing, so if something appears that you do not prefer, the response is no longer frustration, no longer confusion, no longer blame. It is recognition. Recognition that this is not the cause, this is the effect. And if it is the effect, then the cause is still within you, still available, still changeable. And this is where real freedom begins, not the freedom to control the world, but the freedom to no longer depend on it. Because once you realize that nothing outside determines your experience, you are no longer waiting for anything, no longer hoping for conditions to change, no longer limited by what is currently visible. You return to the only place where anything ever begins, the inner state. So the process becomes almost effortless in its simplicity. You notice what you are being. You choose what you prefer to be. And you return to that state again and again until it feels natural. Not forcing it, not fighting for it, but allowing it. Because what you consistently return to becomes your home. And what becomes your home becomes your reality. And this is why persistence is not struggle, it is selection. It is the quiet decision to remain in a state regardless of what appears, to stay aligned with what you have chosen, even when there is no external confirmation yet. Because confirmation is not what creates the state. The state is what creates confirmation. So the question sharpens again. What are you returning to without thinking? Because that is your true state. That is what you have accepted as real. And that is what will continue to express itself until you become aware of it and choose differently. And once you choose differently and remain there long enough, something inevitable happens. The reflection begins to change. Not because you forced it, not because you chased it, but because it cannot remain the same when the source has changed. Because the world is you, pushed out. And if you stay with this long enough, not forcing it, not trying to prove it, but simply observing, something extraordinary begins to reveal itself, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet certainty that changes how you see everything. Because at some point, you begin to notice that what you once believed was solid is actually dependent. That what you once thought was alive on its own is only animated through you. And this realization is not philosophical. It is experiential. You begin to feel that without your awareness, nothing moves, nothing has meaning, nothing continues. It is as though the world you have been watching suddenly slows down, not physically perhaps, but perceptually. And you begin to see that everything is responding. Everything is unfolding in relation to your state, your attention, your identification. And in that moment, something shifts permanently. You no longer feel like a participant inside reality. You feel like the source from which it is being projected. So again, quietly, are you inside the world, or is the world inside you? Because this distinction changes everything. If you believe you are inside it, then you must adapt to it, react to it, adjust yourself to what it presents. But if you begin to sense that it exists within your awareness, then you are no longer bound by it in the same way. You are not escaping it, you are understanding it. And once you understand it, even slightly, you stop fearing it. Because fear comes from believing something outside has power over you. But when you see that what appears is dependent on what you are being, fear begins to dissolve. Not instantly, but gradually, as you recognize that nothing you experience is independent of your own state. And this is where the deepest shift occurs, not in results, not in manifestations, but in identity. You no longer see yourself as someone trying to change life, trying to improve conditions, trying to become something. You begin to see yourself as the one who is already generating the conditions, already expressing the state, already determining the experience through what you are being. So the process simplifies again, but at a deeper level. You do not try to control thoughts. You do not try to eliminate doubt. You do not try to perfect your imagination. You simply become aware of what you are identifying with, and you choose, because identity is always a choice, even when it feels automatic. And once you see that, you realize that nothing is fixed, not your personality, not your patterns, not your circumstances. They only appear fixed because you have been returning to them unconsciously. But the moment you become aware, you introduce a new possibility, the possibility of choosing differently. And when you choose differently and remain there, even when the world appears unchanged, even when nothing confirms it yet, you are doing something far more powerful than reacting you are creating. Quietly, consistently, inevitably. So the question becomes one final time. Are you willing to remain as the one who already is, even when there is no proof? Because that is the threshold. That is where imagination becomes reality. Not when you see it, but when you no longer need to. And when you cross that threshold, something settles. Not excitement, not intensity, but certainty. A calm, grounded knowing that does not depend on evidence, does not require validation, does not look outward for confirmation. Because it has already been accepted within. And once it is accepted within, it cannot fail to appear without. And then, without a clear moment of transition, without any dramatic signal, something ends. Not your life, not your movement, not your desires, but the effort behind them. The subtle tension of trying, the quiet habit of checking, the constant need to measure whether anything is working, it dissolves. Not because you forced it to disappear, but because it no longer belongs to the one you have become. Because once you remain long enough in the state, the idea of getting there loses meaning. You are no longer moving toward anything. You are already being it. And when you are already being it, something fundamental collapses, the illusion of distance. The sense that something is far away, that something must arrive, that something is separate from you, it disappears. Because separation was never real. It was only sustained by identification with the state of not having. And once that identification shifts, everything else follows. Not gradually, not conditionally, but naturally. So again, quietly, are you still waiting, or have you already become? Because waiting implies time, implies process, implies that something must happen before you can feel complete. But becoming removes all of that. Becoming says it is done now, not later. It is real now, not eventually. And when it is real now, reality must reflect it, not because of effort, but because it cannot do otherwise. And this is where the final understanding settles in, not as a concept, but as a recognition you can no longer ignore. You were never trying to manifest anything. You were only moving between states, between wanting and being, between doubt and certainty, between reaction and creation. And whichever state you occupied became your world. So the process was never about effort. It was never about technique. It was never about time. It was always about identity, about what you accepted as true about yourself, about what you felt yourself to be, about what you return to when you stop trying. And once you see that clearly, something irreversible happens. You stop searching, you stop chasing, you stop asking when, because there is no when. There is only now. And now is always the point of creation, not because it leads somewhere, but because it is everything. So if nothing changed from this moment forward, would you still remain? Would you still feel complete? Would you still identify as the one who already has it? Because if the answer is yes, then you have already crossed the threshold. You are no longer dependent on the world to confirm you. The world must now confirm what you are. And when that becomes stable, when that becomes natural, when that becomes who you are without effort, without thought, without trying, something inevitable unfolds. Reality rearranges. Circumstances shift. People respond differently. Opportunities appear, not because you chase them, not because you force them, but because they are reflections of the state you now occupy. Because reality does not lead, it follows. It always has. And in the end, what you discover is not something new. It is something you have always known, quietly, beneath the noise, beneath the effort, beneath the confusion. You were never separate. You were never waiting. You were never lacking. You were only forgetting that you are the source. And now that you remember, everything changes.